So one of the very interesting dialogues that takes place is in 1 Samuel 8, Israel demands a king. And I think this is particularly interesting, I think, because it has the dynamics of power being considered here. And I think power is a very important concept. It has the dynamics of leadership being considered here. There's a number of very interesting things being considered in this asking for a king. So 1 Samuel 8, up to this time, Israel had been led by judges. And so the judges are acting on behalf of God. But not only that, the judges are dispersed. And in Australia, at the moment, we have dispersed states. And in 1901, I think we had a federation. And so the states come together, but we have this separation of powers of the federation, the federal government, and the states. And in the USA, they also have a federation of 52 states. So I think there's something interesting in centralised power in Canberra versus the diversified power that's going on in 1 Samuel 8. So all the elders gather together and come to Samuel and say, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern over us." And I'll ask you in a moment to write down what stands out to you from this passage. You're old, your sons don't follow your ways. Appoint for us a king to govern us like other nations. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." So Samuel reported all the words to the Lord. "Lord, you may not have heard, omniscient one, but the people are saying they want a king. These will be the ways the king will reign over you." And this gets very interesting. So when a king reigns over you, he's going to take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and be his horsemen and run before his chariots. So there's something interesting there about the military. So when you centralize power, you feel as though you should build a solid military. So China, I guess, up until recent times has been a bit more decentralized, but China at the moment is able to build, as one of the most powerful countries in the world, a huge military. One of the interesting things before World War I was that Germany was decentralized states, and then under Bismarck, they brought them together. And then they just seemed to discover, hey, we seem to be the most powerful nation in Europe. And then the other nations felt, well, we don't want a most powerful nation sitting there. And so they came up with the assassination of Duke Ferdinand, and they start a little battle. And so I think there's something takes place whenever you start to think you've got a lot of power. And you can think about this in businesses, what happens when someone gets all the power. You can think about it in families, what happens if someone has all the power. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, some would say. And then verse 12, he will appoint himself commanders of thousands, commanders of 50s, to plough his ground, reap his harvest, make the implements of war and the implements of his chariots. He will take your daughters and perfumers and cooks and bakers. And I wonder there whether it touches on the things you taste and delight and your senses. And then he'll take the best of your fields, and he'll take 1/10 of your grain. So there's taxation there. He'll take your slaves, and he'll take your flocks. So can I get everyone to write down what stands out to you from the dialogue here, where they want a king, they see that kings, they look marvellous. I mean, Buckingham Palace, horses, all of that thing is wonderful. And so you've got certain questions being raised here in this dialogue, which I think is a great example of a dialogue being very powerful. It's a great way to raise different viewpoints. It's a great way to lay out on the table what's taking place. Yeah. So thoughts?
I suppose my main question is like, why is it our investment involved?
Mm.
Like when I moved in, it seems to be as if the people are just rejecting and
Mm.
primarily based on the fact that the environment there are not.
And it's possible that the authors of this are setting it up so that you don't have all the answers. So rather than setting it up clearly, they leave some pieces of the jigsaw left out for you to fill in, some pieces of the crossword squares that are not being filled in. And you're meant to feel some of that disconnect, in that this forces you to actually work with what's going on. So what you're saying is that really it's just the next judges are the problem, not the whole thing. Yeah. And we may even be open to a change in that Saul is going to be the first king, but that's going to end quite disastrously. And the very last chapter of 1 Samuel, we're going to see Saul says to someone, bring a sword, we're defeated, everything's lost, I need to fall on the sword and die. I mean, that's never going to stay in the Bible, 1 Samuel, because it just doesn't end on a good note. So, but anyway, we could accept the Bible as it is, couldn't we? Yeah. What are your thoughts? Yeah. On yeah, Jade. Yeah. Your thoughts on 1 Samuel, where we've got this here, and then others might have thoughts too. The rejection. Yeah. What do you think?
It feels very, because I mean, obviously, you know, God is supposed to be a good king.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, they want a king.
Mm.
But it feels like it's not just a warning, but like a foreshadowing. Like we're going to see, the king's going to take all his wives and the military things. And it's like, like I think later on when we read about the kings and we see them doing like they're taking, and we see the text showing that they're taking things, showing that they're not acting in a godly way, that they're taking in their, like you said about like the sense, with their power.
Yes, I think narrative often brings out the tensions that exist within people, between people, and even within us, between our head and our heart. So I think there's some great things. Thoughts here?
I was going to say, just in that part, like they were free to do what they wanted to, but in the day, there would be like.
And often in a narrative and in a dialogue, you'll see, those sorts of tensions. I love that. That's really good. Yeah, thoughts?
That's why specifically a king? Why did you ask for that specifically?
Yeah.
And also, like, we were interested prime powers by requesting the king. So the question prior to this period, because you had female judges, you had different other forms of government, you had different voices in the community who has power, who has big standards and all that stuff. Why is that not working? And why can't that not be revised? That you need it in. Because if you just like what we said before, but it's a rejection of God almost to have this centralized power. And also it sounds like you can see Samuel's wisdom. Like he already knows it's doing. And what does that be from him anticipating or him having seen it in other surrounding like tribes or nations? Like, why would you not use his wisdom? Maybe that's like at the time, other places and
both of them very different alpha. If that's the both our idea of monarchy, also salvation is very in the same different ones. So we do have somewhat kind of like we're still very decentralized in the long time.
Let's ask Matthew online. Matthew, do you see things here in this tension and questions over the seeking of a king.
Yeah, if I was to relate it perhaps back to a theme, good and evil, this idea of, well, there's that proverb, what was it? I think it's the way of the fool seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. And it's obvious from Torah, Deuteronomy, that, you know, Israel has a king. They're not like other nations, but Israel have king envy, it would seem, with all these other nations around them. And it's kind of like the prophet puts it out there. It's like, well, it's going to cost you. You can see it as foreshadowing the demise, and, you know, their foolishness in their choice again is going to have consequences. So it's kind of just that theme, good and evil. Again, man seeking his own wisdom over the wisdom of God.
Very good. Now, I think this is a great passage to explore further. If you're looking for a passage to do an assignment on, I was saying to some other students, they were talking about image and image bearers, and I think that passage in Exodus where they make the golden calf, I think, is quite a significant passage that wrestles with image of God, in that I think who we think God is, how we understand God from last week's discussion in Exodus is important. I think this passage here, how we understand power and power relationships, is very important. And maybe this too applies to marriage relationships. That is, if you want one tough person in marriage who has the authority and one centralized bank account, etc., that there is a danger in having power relationships that are pyramid shaped. And Jesus picks up the idea that we need an upside down pyramid. Servanthood is the way to go, and washes the disciples' feet and says it won't be like the way nations have power. It'll be serving one another that actually brings the answers to your needs. And then Jesus dies on the cross, again, showing that costly sacrifice of serving. So I think these concepts of power, and then Jesus turning power upside down and God turning ideas of power upside down, this gives us a very different idea of God. I think a lot of people would like to see God as the all-powerful one who says, do this, go there. God directs our steps very, and this is very fundamentalist thinking, in the less healthy way. Rather, if there is a dialogue between us and God, God invites us to pray to him, talk with him, pray with one another, talk with one another, and come humbly before God and say, God, I'm open to your guidance and your instructions. That's healthier than saying, God, dictate to me and tell me where to go. So there's questions of power that are raised here. There is a book written in 2019 by Moshe Halbertal and Stephen Holmes called The Beginnings of Politics, Power in the Biblical Book of Samuel, in which the book of Samuel, being one of the great pieces of biblical literature with some great dialogue in it, but the authors say that the book's anonymous author is more than an inspired storyteller. They're an astute observer of life and political life and power and moral compromises and contradictions and what the struggle of power inevitably entails. So The Beginning of Politics, this book, looks at the story of Israel's kings and looks at a history of power, and it sees that the history of political thought is related to power. And a lot of our world is shaped by these power questions. That is, here in Australia, a decision was made 1901 that we shouldn't just have different offshoots from the British centre of power, but we should federate together. And so power dictates the taxes you pay, power dictates the access that you have to support you, the access to education. We're seeing a sudden change of power taking in Afghanistan at the moment. And so they've gone over there for 20 years that said women should have equality. And then within weeks, probably that'll all be gone as they go to a different system of power. So power really does shape a lot of what happens in our worlds. The only trouble is when I talk to politicians, they say that if you ever become a politician, you have no power either. It's just the one person at the top and a few people at the top make a decision. And if you're part of the party, you simply got to say, yes, sir, we support you. And so politicians appear to be a bit powerless as well. So it's questionable where the power is. Is it with the media? Is it with the economic system? There's all sorts of questions about power. But I think chapter 8 here raises some of these power questions quite well, as do many other stories of power here. Then we see Saul as the first king, and you could read more carefully what's unfolding there. Then we see David, an unassuming shepherd that becomes God's choice of a king to replace Saul. Now notice he's not the eldest of the brothers or the second or the third or the fourth elder. He's further down the line, but he's developed skills. So he brings the skills with a slingshot to facing Goliath. And so David and Goliath is another very interesting passage in dialogue. And I think that would be a great dialogue to work through. If you want a little exercise to put up on our forum, you could think about David and Goliath. Can I get everyone to just write a line or two of dialogue from David and Goliath? Does anyone know it's in chapter 16, I think, is it David and Goliath? So I assume, so David, Goliath, Samuel 17, 1 Samuel 17. So let's go to 1 Samuel 17, New Revised Standard Version. And then can I get you to just write a line, just make it up any way you want. Just write down a line of dialogue yourself. So David, he's not one of the older brothers. He doesn't go to the war, but he is allowed to take cheeses to the commanders there. So he's got a little role to play, but he's also defeated bears and other animals that have attacked the sheep. And then David says, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine? And the people said, these will be the benefits that you'll get from there, and you'll have the Saul's daughter, and there'll be other benefits as well. And then David says to Saul, let no one's heart fail because of him, Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And Saul said, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight him. You're just a boy, and he's a warrior since his youth. And David said, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb, I went after it. I struck it down. I rescued the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned again, I would catch it and strike it down and kill it. So he had developed skills. And so Saul said to David, may the Lord be with you. This reminds me of a young French woman in her late teen years who decided to go down and say to the French king, we should rise up against the English people and chase them out of here. And then in parts of France, they build golden statues of this woman riding on a horse. And her name is Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc. And so there is a place for people rising up and as youth and taking on there. Interesting with the Joan of Arc story, they later held a trial, and others did the trial, and they burned her at the stake. So it was gone. But people appealed against it and said they got it wrong. So they held a retrial and they found her not guilty. So that's the good side of the story. Hey? Well, that's true. That's true. And she was very heroic. And in the end, the French did get back the land for the French rather than for the British. And so in many ways, she led people, and even to this day, she still inspires people. And so there is much narrative there as well. So Goliath comes, he fights, and fights with the sword there. So you might want to write down a little bit of narrative and David said to Goliath. Yeah, and there's a great deal of great narrative there as well. And then we come to the end of David's life. And then after David's life, can I get you to turn, if you've got a chance, to 2 Samuel 1, New Revised Standard Version. And so we have Solomon there. So David mourns for Saul there, and Jonathan. After the death of Saul, David returned. And there's a huge amount of narrative that takes here, and David's lamenting there. So we could look at that. We probably don't have time to really go to that in a great deal of further detail. If we go to 1 Kings chapter 1, New Revised Standard Version. So I'm just touching on these now to carry us through the biblical narrative. King David was old, advanced in years, and then we find that Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, says, have you heard that Adonijah has become king? David doesn't know it. And of course, David really wanted Solomon to be king. And so there is a battle takes place here, and eventually Solomon does become the king. And in the next chapters, can we go to 1 Kings 11? So Solomon's becoming king. Solomon's very wise. Everything's going very well. And then in 1 Kings 11, we find a change in the whole narrative. So Solomon's very wise, things have gone very well. And then Solomon notices a nice lady who's the daughter of Pharaoh and says that would make a good wife. And then he looks a bit further and there's a daughter of the Moabites, and he says that would make a good wife. And he looks further and says there's a daughter of the Ammonites, and he says that would make a good wife. And then he looks to the Edomites and says that would make a good wife. And before he knows it, he's accidentally married 700 women. I mean, these things can happen. And some people would say it's political alliances as well. And so again, we've got politics and alliances and compromises. And so Solomon becomes the most powerful of the leaders, but the very strength can be the undoing of the whole nation. And so there's a lot going on here in 1 Kings 11. And so this is both the peak of the biblical narrative from Genesis to 1 Kings 11. We've now got Solomon. He builds a temple. And just as Moses took them towards the promised land, we've now got the promised land. And if you want to explore archaeology, then all around the Jerusalem Mount of Olives, you've got Solomon Temple, little bits of remains. This is where archaeology really becomes more interesting. And so you can go there and explore remains on the side of the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount is there with the Dome of the Rock and other buildings on the Temple Mount. But down the side of that Temple Mount area, so this is the temple as it used to be up on the Temple Mount, and then down the side now you've got remains that date back to the time of Solomon, so you can explore back in those areas. And then after that we get more and more archaeological remains there on the Temple Mount in Israel. So it's quite fascinating, the different remnants that are there. So I might pause at that point. Next week, we're going to go on to, and I'll ask you in a moment what assignments you're doing, and we'll discuss that for about 10 or 15 minutes before we finish. Next week, we go on to our first class on poetry and the Psalms. And so I'd ask you, if you get a chance between now and next week, I'd like everyone to go to the forum post for next week and to put up either a short piece of poem that you write yourself or a short psalm that you write yourself. And it's very easy to write a psalm for yourself. So you could choose a psalm like Psalm 1, and then you could think about what's there, and choose any psalm of the 150 psalms. And then Psalm 1 just simply, blessed is the one who walks not according to the wicked, but according to the law of the Lord. And you could just start writing a poem or a psalm and simply say, I feel blessed. And you could talk about, I feel blessed when I wake up in the morning and the sun is shining. And I like poetry and literature, and poetry in particular, that flows freely, free writing, subconscious. And so you just start off with, I feel blessed. I wake up in the morning, the sun's shining. And even when a shadow comes over the sun, that'll pass. And even when annoyance, my kids come and bug me, that too will pass. Poetry can flow quite easily that way. And I think we should value one another's expressions. So if you want to start with any sentence that is there in any psalm, any sentence, any verse, I'd like to encourage you next week just to write a little something. Or if you wanted to try something more poetic, then you could try that as well. There's all sorts of things that you could write. Just a little one, if I can be briefly self-indulgent. A grey pigeon stands for a moment, then casually picks at a grain or two scattered across the ground. Gentle, soft feathers protect it from the cold, perhaps a gift from above. I went to where Jonah was at Joppa, and they've got boats there, and they set out, and Jonah set out to escape and then eventually came back. And that's where Simon Peter went, and they got a sign over an old house there that's hundreds, if not thousands of years old, saying this is where Simon Peter went. So I went there, and as I was walking along the water's edge where Jonah set out to sea, in front of me was a grey pigeon. And so I wrote a little poem about it. This moment has unfolded many times before. This occasion, one of many. A quick movement, pouncing, then halting and standing still. The sharp claws of a ginger cat grasp the feather coat, frozen with surprise, catching its last breath. Friend or foe, no time to ask. The captive suddenly twists and turns, but to no avail. If only it could devise a plan, if only it stayed a little longer at another place or time. Pictures fill the mind of a flight to safety, but the claws and teeth tighten their grip, eyes wide open, then shut tight. That could be me even watching. What you cannot see cannot hurt you, some say. Seeing this sight unfolding before my eyes, I reach down and shake the poor creature free. The startled cat looks up for a moment, and then in its brightly coloured orange fur coat, it dashes away into the undergrowth. The startled bird looks at me for a moment. It sees its opportunity and rushes swiftly away to the safety of branches in a distant tree. And someday, at some future time, perhaps someone will likewise be there for me to see my plight and understand the difference made by a helping hand or an opportune word, and give what time they can from busy schedules and show me a way to guide me to a safer place and to help me back on the road to a pathway home, a secure place with friends and freedom, and accept me as I am. So I saw a pigeon and I wrote that down. And then I wrote a little bit more, but someone said I should chop this out. And on Sunday, I'm told, a hand far above reached down to set me free near a tree called Calvary. And people said that's a bit religious, so I should leave that out. So I'll stop at that point. Yeah. So you can just follow thoughts in your mind. And I think in some ways the Psalms, we'll look a bit more at poetry in the Psalms next week. And that's just a brief introduction about how a pigeon escaped his fate and lived a bit longer. So can I just ask a bit more about your assignments now in the last 10 minutes or so, and what you're proposing to do with your assignment. So Jade, tell us a bit about your assignment, what you're planning to do.
No, I don't know.
Yes.
So I had a lot of ideas none fully thought out, but
Mhm.
what do you think about
Mm.
like discussing how we see the story of Jacob and Esau? We
Mm.
see how Esau very unexpectedly welcomes him home, and he could be kind of like a representation of like us, you know, in modern day time. We can be in the image of God, and that can make a real difference in people's lives. So Jacob, he's done his brother wrong and journeyed and wrestled with God, and he has, he's been encountered with God in the previous chapter. That really humbles him, but from my reading of the story, I think it's not until he encounters Esau and Esau's forgiveness and welcome causes him to just break down in tears. And I think it's in that moment when he fully steps into what God is wanting for him. He's had Esau has been the face of God to him, and says that he's wanted that. Yeah, and so I thought that was a good story. And so if talking about that, and then the whole essay's kind of point is to say, well, we're also called to be the face of God for people. Is that a place I can take it, or am I supposed to just stay on the analysis of the Old Testament story, or can I take it more into that?
Yeah, I would keep that as a hypothesis, and then I would see how a couple of weeks of research gives you information that will either support your hypothesis or not. And so I think, I think that's quite possible. So just run me in one sentence again where this goal is that you may end up at.
We're called to be the face of God to people.
Mm.
I don't know if that, I don't know if it's too, like something you could share at a Bible study, or if it's something you can talk about in this kind of essay.
You'd have to ask if that is the major point being made here. So you'd have to read the text again and again, and then ask what is the major point being made here between Esau, the welcoming Esau and Jacob. In order to do that, you've got to look at the wider context. So you've got to look at as many chapters before and after that as you can. You've got to briefly, I suppose, look at Genesis 1 to 50, but you don't want to spend too long there. And so you've got to think, you're right, God's made a good world. He's also including chapters that are talking about the fallenness of the world, and in the Jacob Esau wrestling, he's talking about there are these tensions. Now, there's some scholarly philosophy about the idea that we wrestle with one another, and certainly René Girard, so if you want a quick way to find the scholar, René Girard talks about imitation. And so he says we all imitate one another, therefore eventually we're going to fight with one another. And whenever you have more than one child, if you have one child, you've got problems because they're spoiled. If you have more than one child, you've got problems because they fight. And so here, I think this is a universal truth. And so the universal truth, according to René Girard, is that we're all going to fight over the same thing. And you give one child a guitar and another child drums, then the drum one wants the guitar because the other one's got it. And so there's always a fight. And so people seek to wrestle over it. So I think all of these things are going on in the Jacob Esau. And so rather than starting with the answer, if the cards play and the evidence plays, then certainly you may find support for your hypothesis, but only if the evidence goes that way. So you're like a doctor going into a operating room or a medical clinic, and someone says they've got a pain here, and you're thinking immediately, you think this is the outcome. but you've got to suspend your decision until you've looked at all of the tests and evidence. So that would be my thought, is look at the evidence, analyse it, look for strong scholars. And if you want one, René Girard is one strong scholar. There could be others too. Yeah. Yeah.
It says in the task sheet that we're not expected to engage in like lots of scholarly sources, which I don't understand. Like, how many references are you expecting, and is then the primary text the Bible?
That was the original goal a couple of years ago. I'm impressed by scholarly sources, but I'm more impressed by your original thoughts as well. And so when you go to a scholarly source, then you've got concepts and ideas and the source. But when you work it through, and so you're working through the idea, and maybe it's two separate assignments you're working with. One is the image of God assignment, and then the other is the Esau-Jacob assignment. So I think you've got to treat them separately and keep them as separate files on your computer. And if they happen to come across, then it would only work if they were joined by there. So leave it till another day, the image of God one, and work with what there could be more interesting things in the Esau-Jacob one. So I think I would certainly put the passages you're looking at, the key concepts and ideas you're looking at, jealousy, Bible, Old Testament, into Google Scholar, into the CHC library catalogue, into the CHC library journey, EBSCO host, into the CHC library journal, ProQuest, put all the ideas in there and see what scholarly resources come out. And I tend to think students tend to do better when they have more scholarly resources, is what I think. However, the original statement, it was to get you thinking about the biblical text and owning the biblical text yourself, because one of the great dangers is you could be just summarizing what scholars say, not thinking about what the text itself is saying. And so that's the aim and goal of that, to get you working with the text. And they say the same thing with history. We could tell you what Martin Luther said, but wouldn't it be good if you went back and read what Martin Luther wrote and then made your decisions and said, this is what's happening? And you'll only ever become a good historian if you go back and look at that material. You'll only ever become a good biblical scholar if you look at what the biblical text says and say things that no one else has ever said. So you've got to find your own voice, your own originality, etc. Yeah. So a bit of both, 50% scholars, 50% there. Assignment statement, you said yours was? Yeah, yes, I think Daniel and Revelations is a good one. Again, you're looking for solid scholarly concepts. I think symbols is really key there. And you might even want to just choose one passage and some symbols that link together. I mean, people could write a whole assignment on Babylon and those sorts of things there. Yeah, so probably you don't want too many. But find something in Daniel and Revelation that leaps out. Find something that most strong, if you're wanting to do both of them, find something that really strongly links together. Remember, we're looking at literature. So we're after literature ideas such as storyline, character, and today dialogue. Next week we're doing poetics and poetry and parallelism. We mentioned chiasm today. So any literature things. Yours is on Ruth. Yeah. And so, yeah, again, looking for literature ideas. Any questions, thoughts?
Not right now.
Yep.
I think I've got the basic idea of what I want to do. I just have to now research to see how much I can do on that.
Yep. So, yeah. So I encourage you this week, if you can, send me just a short sentence or two which says, this is the topic I'm doing. This is the way I'm looking at approaching it. And then any questions you want to add to that, add them. Any thoughts you want to add, then add those as well. And then I'm happy to respond to those, and I can give you some useful responses to those. Yeah. So we might stop at that point. Matthew, if you wanted to add, hang on at all for 2 or 3 minutes, I can answer questions to yourself. Any of the students here in class, if you want to hang on for 2 or 3 minutes and ask me questions about your assignments or anything we're doing, then I encourage you to do that. I will have a look at the online, make sure you can get there as well. I'll put a fair bit of material up, so if you find it overwhelming, tell me, and then I can make it less. And if you want more, then let me know, then I can even email and pass on different material to you. Otherwise, next week, see you at 10 o'clock, looking at the Psalms and poems. And if you can post up either a little poem, little psalm, we're all doing it together. We're all wearing bare feet together, so we don't have to be embarrassed. Then it'll be a chance to stretch and practice a little bit. What's it mean to write poetically? So poetry of the Psalms next week. And one of the things I find quite interesting is that all these literatures help us understand humans a lot more. Even today, we saw dialogue, different voices, how they help us. They help us understand God, in that if there is someone in the past eternally before us, someone in the future, and he's speaking to us and wants to speak to us and hears us and all of that, then all of literature helps us understand what dialogue is about, what being a relational person is about. So it's a great subject. Look forward to catching up next week with poetry in the Psalms. Thank you.